The story of Loki and the Ranger. Introduction. Who is the Ranger? A story of fate, strength, and the unbreakable bond with Loki. In the vast, winding path of fate, there are those who shape their own destiny, carving their way through the world with resilience, fire, and an unyielding will. And then there is the Ranger, a woman of the wild, a warrior of the unseen battles, a soul not forged in palaces, but in the heart of the untamed, where the wind speaks in hushed whispers and the trees remember stories older than time itself. She was never meant to be a queen nor a conqueror, nor a name spoken in the halls of gods. But she became something far greater. She became a legend. So who is she? The Ranger is not defined by where she came from, but by what she has endured. A woman of skill, of strategy. She has walked the razor's edge between light and shadow, between worlds known and unknown. She does not bow easily. She does not break. She is sharp of mind, quick of wit, and fiercely loyal to those who have earned her trust, though few have. Her presence is steady, her spirit unwavering, her strength carved from the trials of survival, not from the blessings of the god. But it is this very strength that sets her apart, because she is mortal. And yet she stands among gods without fear. How she met Loki. It was never supposed to happen. Their path should never have crossed. The god of mischief and the Ranger, a mere mortal. And yet, fate had other plans. It was not in the Golden Hall, nor in the mists of war, but in the wild, in the places forgotten by time, where their lives first intertwined. She was not looking for him, and he was not searching for her. And yet they found each other. At first they were reluctant allies, forced together by circumstance, bound by a mutual enemy neither could defeat alone. But battle after battle, moment after moment, the walls between them began to crack. She saw beyond the illusion, beyond the silver tongue and the sharp smirks. She saw the loneliness behind the mask, the sharp edges of a man who had never truly belonged. And he saw her, not as a pawn, not as a fragile mortal meant to be used and discarded, but as something else, something worthy. And before neither of them could stop it, before Loki could weave his next lie, before the Ranger could reinforce their defenses, something had already taken root between them. Something that even the gods could not undo. The Ranger was never meant to change him. She was never meant to save him. But she did what no one else had done. She believed in him. And Loki, the lost prince, the trickster, the god who had spent lifetimes pretending he did not care. He believed in her too. And that changed everything. So who is the Ranger? She is more than a warrior, more than a survivor. She is the one thing Loki never knew he needed. A mirror in the darkness. A home he had never thought he would find. And that is what makes her unstoppable. Chapter 1. The firelight flickered within the sanctuary, casting long shadows across the walls, lined with books and forgotten wisdom and ancient power. The sound of the waterfall outside was a steady, rhythmic whisper, a heartbeat to the space that Loki called his own. This was his refuge, his sanctuary, his kingdom beyond the reach of prying eyes. And tonight, someone had dared to desecrate it. The air felt wrong. It had started subtly, a faint chill that even the fire could not chase away. The scent of the place, usually rich with parchment, old leather, and the lingering spice of Asgardian wine, had turned hollow, sterile, unnatural. Loki had noticed it the moment he returned, his instincts sharpening to a blade's edge. Then he saw her. The ranger lay motionless on the great bed tucked within the alcove, her face bathed in the warm glow of the fire. She looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Too still. The moment Loki stepped closer, his heart clenched. Her breath was there, but it was shallow, her skin unnaturally cool beneath his touch. A sheen of sweat lined her forehead, her fingers twitching ever so slightly, as though fighting something he could not see. Someone had done this. And in that moment, a low, velvety chuckle filled the air, laced with the echo of a past Loki had long left behind. Ah, Loki, I was beginning to think you would notice. The voice slithered through the room like poisoned silk, and Loki went still. Not out of fear, not out of shock, but out of the razor-thin restraint between civility and destruction. Mora, he said. His voice quiet, edged with something lethal. She emerged from the shadows near the bookshelves, draped in shimmering black, her silver hair coiling like threads of moonlight around her shoulders. Her eyes piercing, almost luminous, held the smug amusement of a cat toying with its prey. Loki's jaw tightened. You have 5 seconds to explain before I tear your wretched existence apart. Mora chuckled, stepping closer, her finger ghosting over the spines of his books, as though she belonged here. Is that any way to greet an old acquaintance? Especially when I have brought such an interesting gift. His gaze snapped back to the ranger, still locked in unnatural slumber. What did you do to her? Mora tilted her head. I simply expanded her mind, showed her the door to things she was never meant to see. A world of nightmares, of truth beneath truth. And now, my dear Loki, she is trapped in a place she cannot wake from, unless I choose to free her. A slow, seething breath left him. You dare. Oh, I'm more than dare, my sweet trickster, she purred, stepping into the light fully now. You see, I remember you as you once were. A master of deception, a player in the great game of gods and mortals. But now, you care for someone. How terribly mortal of you. His hands clenched into fists, magic crackling beneath his skin like an impending storm. You have made a mistake so grievous, Mora, that not even the gods will be able to save you from what comes next. Mora only smiled, her amusement undeterred. Have I? She mused, her tone like a blade dragged slowly against glass. Or have I merely given you a reminder of who you truly are? Let's find out, shall we? And with that, the shadows surged forward. Loki did not hesitate. The fire in the hearth roared violently as raw, unfeathered power erupted from within him, shaking the sanctuary to its core. The air split with a sound like cracking ice. The very walls seemed to bend around the force of his rage. Gone was the smirking, silver-tongued trickster. In his place stood something else entirely. Something terrifying. Something even Mora, for the first time in her wretched existence, had not accounted for. The storm had come, and Loki was its master. The chase begins. The very air trembled, caught between the rippling falls of raw magic and the sheer force of Loki's rage. The fire in the hearth twisted, licking up the walls as if possessed, shadows warping and coiling around him like a living storm. For the first time in her wretched existence, Mora staggered back. "Loki," she breathed, her voice still edged with amusement, but now there was something else lurking beneath it. Doubt. Good. He did not answer her, not with words. He lifted a single hand, and with it the walls of the sanctuary shuddered, the bookshelves groaned. The very structure of his domain warped under the pressure of his fury. She had expected anger. She had expected threats. But this silence, was something else entirely. Mora had seen him play at rage before, had seen him taunt, feign, manipulate. He had always wielded his temper like a finely honed dagger. Precise, calculated, a performance of fire and words. This was different. This was cold. This was death. "You should run," Loki murmured. And it was not a suggestion. It was not a warning. It was a sentence. The air fractured. Shadows tore away from their rightful places, twisted into jagged, unnatural shapes as they lurched toward her. And Mora did what she had not done in a very, very long time. She ran. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she ripped open a portal, a jagged tear in space, leading into the great abyss of the yawning void, a place between realms. She did not look back. She could feel him behind her, feel the storm closing in, and for the first time in centuries, she feared. She landed hard, the world shifting around her as she stumbled into the dense forest of Alfheim. The air was thick with golden mist, ancient trees towering high above. Here the light was a shield, a sacred force that no darkness could penetrate. Here she could... No. The moment she turned, she saw him. Loki stood at the edge of the clearing, wreathed in the shadows that curled around him like the tendrils of some primordial beast. The light of Alfheim, pure, untouchable, dimmed in his presence. "You'll have to do better than that," he said, voice smooth, measured, amused. Mora bolted. She tore through the trees, the very world shifting as she opened another portal. Vanaheim, only to feel the cold fingers of his magic graze her shoulder, just as she crossed through. She did not slow. She could not slow. Through Vanaheim, through the frozen wastes of Jotunheim, through the desolation of Muspelheim she ran. And every time, every single time, he was already there. He did not chase her in a way a predator might. He did not run after her. He simply was. A step behind, a whisper at her ear, a breath on her neck. No matter how fast she moved, no matter how many realms she crossed, she could not outrun him. Because she had not just provoked Loki, she had unleashed him. And now there was nowhere left to hide. A moment to breathe. Mora stumbled into the towering ruins of Nidavellir, her breath ragged, her magic fraying at the edges. The ancient forge city lay in an eerie silence, the great mechanisms of the dwarfs long stilled. Blackened stone and a rusted iron stretched in every direction. The remains of once great machines standing like the bones of giants. She pressed her hand to her chest, willing herself to steady. He is not here. She did not believe it. Loki had been there every step. His presence bleeding into every realm she had fled to. His wrath was not a mere storm. It was relentless, a force outside of time and space. And yet, now, silence. Mora let out a breath, allowing the shadows around her to settle. Her fingers twitched, drawing invisible sigils in the air, weaving a spell so delicate that even the gods themselves would struggle to detect it. A trap, a final play. If she could not escape him, then she would bind him. Mora knew Loki better than most, knew that his greatest strength, his mind, his cunning, was also his weakness. He expected tricks. He lived for them. So she would not offer him a lie. She would offer him the truth, twisted, distorted, turned into a noose he would not see coming. The hunter arrives. She did not have to wait long. A ripple in the air, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the fabric of reality itself. And then he was there. Loki did not step through a portal, did not appear in a flash of light. He simply was. Standing at the edge of the ruined forge, cloaked in flickering shadows that breathed and coiled around his form. The molten glow of fading embers reflected in his eyes, but there was no warmth in them, only an abyss of cold, unrelenting fury. Mora straightened, forcing a smirk onto her lips. "You are persistent," she admitted, tilting her head. "And I do so love a persistent man." Loki said nothing. His silence was worse than words. Mora felt a sliver of something sharp press against her spine, a sensation she had not known in a long, long time. Fear. But she would not cower. She flicked her wrist. The sigils woven into the very air flared, the ancient stone beneath them shuddering as the spell ignited. Tendrils of raw, pulsing magic lashed out from the ruins, snapping towards Loki, binding him, dragging at his essence, his very form. A cage of truth, woven with the echoes of his own mind. For a flickering instant, Loki's form blurred, his expression unreadable. And then he laughed. Low, amused, almost pitying. Mora's breath hitched. That was not the reaction she had expected. "Clever," Loki murmured, rolling his shoulders as the magic crackled around him. "But did you truly think you could trap me in my own tricks?" The bindings, woven from ancient, undeniable truth, collapsed in on themselves. Mora had barely time to register the reversal before the spell turned, before her own magic coiled around her, tightening, crushing. A strangled breath left her lips, And then, suddenly, nothing. She was no longer in Nidavellir. She was nowhere. The ruins, the stone, the embers, gone. Only shadows remained. She turned sharply, her heart hammering. What did you? Loki stood before her, untouched, unbothered. "I let you run," he said simply, his voice almost gentle. "I let you hope." He stepped closer. The darkness bent to him. "But you were never going to escape me, Mora." His voice, so calm, so patient, sent a cold, crawling dread through her bones. Because for the first time in her existence, Mora understood. She had not stirred a dragon. She had awakened it, and now it was hungry. The last trick. The darkness breathed around her, cold, silent, unforgiving. Mora was no stranger to shadows. She had wielded them, bent them to her will, twisted them into illusions so seamless that even gods had faltered before her. But this was something else. Loki had always been a master of deception, a weaver of lies, a dancer on the knife's edge between truth and trickery. She had known him as that Loki, the sly, silver-tongued prince who played with chaos. But the god standing before her now was no longer playing. He had become the fire. Mora swallowed hard, smoothing the tremor in her breath, forcing a smirk onto her lips. My, she purred, tilting her head just enough to mask the war raging in her mind. Look at you, how you've grown. Loki said nothing. His silence was a weight, pressing against the very fabric of her magic. Mora felt it, his presence shifting, warping the very air. The space around them was unnatural, not tethered to any single realm. He had ripped her from reality, cast her into something between, something beyond. And yet, he was calm. Not seething, not screaming. No. This was a Loki who had transcended the rage that had once consumed him. He did not need to prove his power. He was power, which meant she had one chance. Her fingers twitched ever so slightly, barely perceptible to the untrained eye. A whisper of a spell, ancient and dangerous, slipped between the folds of her voice. "You always did have a soft spot for me," she murmured, stepping forward slow and deliberate. "A weakness, I think." She let her magic seep into her words, weaving around his mind like silk, a delicate thread of persuasion. "Perhaps we don't have to be enemies, Loki. Perhaps this doesn't have to end in blood and ruin." She reached out, her fingers ghosting along his wrist, her lips curving in a slow, knowing smile. "Let me show you what we could be." Her voice caught, because the moment she touched him, she felt nothing. No warmth, no breath, no reaction. Just a void. She looked up into his eyes and froze. They were not green. Not anymore. A raw, unfiltered light burned within them. Not fire, not rage, not the flickering amber of mischief she had once known. This was power. Pure, cold, unyielding. And then he laughed. Low, quiet, almost pitying. Mora's blood ran cold. "Oh, Mora," Loki murmured, voice smooth as silk, rich as velvet. "You think this is still a game, don't you?" His wrist twisted just slightly, and her entire spell shattered. The force of it threw her back like a puppet cut from its strings. She hit the ground hard, gasping, as her own magic cracked against her rib like a whip. She scrambled up, mind reeling, hands clawing for another spell, any spell. And then Loki was there, right in front of her. "Did you think I would fall for that?" he asked, his voice still calm. "That I would bow to tricks? To honeyed words?" He bent down slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. He bent down slightly, his smirk razor sharp. "I'm no longer the god of petty illusions, Mora." The space around them rippled, his presence pressing against reality itself. "I am something far, far worse." The air collapsed around him. A silent detonation of magic so ancient, so primal, that Mora barely had time to scream before the force of it ripped through her. Darkness surged, and then silence. The moment of reckoning. She awoke, gasping. Her body ached, her mind splintered at the edges, as though she had been unmade and rebuilt by something she could not comprehend. She was back in his sanctuary. The fire still burned in the hearth, the waterfall still roared beyond the windows, the bookshelf still stood, unmoved. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Except she could not move. Loki stood over her, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "You should be grateful," he said softly. "I could have left you lost in the abyss, but I thought—" His smirk returned, sharp as a dagger. "It would be more fitting for you to wake up here, in the very place you defiled." Mora trembled, not from pain, not from exhaustion, but from true, unrelenting fear. Because for the first time, she understood. Loki had not merely changed, he had evolved. And she, who once believed she could control him, trick him, bend him, had been nothing more than a fool standing in the path of a storm. The final question. Loki crouched before her, tilting his head slightly. "Now, tell me, Mora," he murmured, voice like velvet and steel. "What lesson have you learned today?" His smirk deepened. "And should I let you live long enough to remember it?" The plea of a fool. Mora's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. The world around her still felt wrong, as if Loki had rewritten reality itself to suit his will. Perhaps he had. She was bound, not by chains, not by magic she could feel, but by something worse. By him. The weight of his presence pressed against her like a slow, inevitable descent of a blade against a fragile throat. His power wrapped around her, unseen, yet undeniable. It watched her, judged her. She had danced on the edge of gods before, had charmed kings, twisted heroes, undone empires with nothing but whispers and well-placed shadows. But none of that would save her now. "Loki," she gasped, forcing a small, delicate tremble in her voice. "You don't want to do this." His expression remained unreadable. "I was." She wet her lips, shifting slightly. "I was only playing. You know that. Just a game. A test even. You, of all people, should understand the thrill of the gamble." Still he did not move. Mora let out a soft, breathy laugh, as if the situation could still be turned, as if she could weave the right words and pull him back from this abyss. "You've won, trickster. You have me. What more do you want?" Loki's head tilted slightly, the dim firelight casting shifting shadows over his face. "Want?" His voice calm, cool, dangerous. "What makes you believe I want anything at all?" She forced a chuckle, but it wavers. "Oh, come now. I know you, Loki. I know the look in your eyes when you're playing the long game. You've already thought 3 steps ahead, haven't you?" She softened her gaze, letting her lips curve into something almost genuine. "So tell me, what is my part in it?" Loki let out a quiet breath, a chuckle. It sent a chill down her spine. "Mora," he murmured, his voice silk-lined steel. "You are under the impression that you still have a role to play." She stiffened, her heart beat a wild, frantic drum in her chest. His smirk was slow, almost indulgent. "Shall I tell you the truth?" Mora swallowed hard, her mind racing. "You are not a piece on my board, Mora," Loki continued. "You are a broken game I no longer have any interest in playing." Her stomach twisted. No, that wasn't right. He had to want something. She could work with something, a bargain, a deception, a distraction. But nothing? Nothing was a void she could not manipulate. Then kill me," she whispered, trying to make it sound like a challenge. "End it then, Loki." His smirk sharpened. "Oh, now, why would I do that?" Mora felt a flicker of something far worse than fear. Because Loki wasn't angry anymore. He was amused. She had seen anger in him before. She had seen fury, pettiness, even cruelty. But this quiet, this terrible, patient knowing. This was new, and it was terrifying. "Do you think death is the worst thing that I could give you?" Loki asked softly. "Oh, Mora, you should know better than that." His fingers twitched, and suddenly she couldn't breathe. Not because of magic, not because of an unseen force, because she was somewhere else. A void, a space of nothingness. No air, no heat, no cold, no walls. No ground beneath her feet. Just emptiness. And then voices, whispers, her whispers. The echoes of every lie she had ever told. Every manipulation, every twisted game. They whispered back to her. You are nothing. You are powerless. You are forgotten. He does not care. You are lost. Mora screamed. And then she was back. The fire burned beside her once more. The walls of the sanctuary stood unmoved. But she was shaking. Loki watched her, eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Do you understand now?" Mora sucked in a breath, barely holding herself together. "You," her voice broke. "What are you?" His smirk returned, slow, amused, lethal. "And I'm the god who thought you could deceive," Loki murmured. "And you," he leaned in, so close that his breath ghosted over her cheek. "You are at my mercy." Mora clenched her jaw, trying to summon her pride, her composure. But Loki only chuckled. "Don't fight it, Mora," he whispered, a cruel sort of mirth in his voice. "It will only hurt more if you do." She had lost, completely, utterly. And for the first time in her existence, Mora had no more tricks left to play. The sentence. The silence between them stretched. Mora knelt where she had fallen, her breath shallow, her mind spinning from what had just transpired. She had lost, utterly. And the god before her, the true Loki, the one unshackled by games, by illusions, by the need to prove himself, stood watching her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "I should end you." His voice was quiet. It was worse than if he had shouted. "I should unravel you at the seams, wipe your name from the tongues of gods and mortals alike. Let time forget you ever existed." Mora swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Then do it," she whispered. "Finish it." A smirk curled up in the corner of his lips, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, Mora," he murmured, stepping closer, his presence a suffocating weight of power. "How little you understand." She flinched as he raised his hand. But there was no strike, no final blow. Instead, she felt it. Her power tearing away from her like silk being unraveled, like strings being severed. Mora gasped, clutching at her chest as if she could hold on to it, as if she could stop the inevitable. The magic she had wielded for centuries, the strength she had relied upon, the shadows that had always answered her call. Gone. A hollow remained where they had once been. "What?" Her voice shook. Panic laced her words. "What have you done?" Loki tilted his head, watching her with quiet amusement. "You once sought to trap another's mind in a prison of nightmares," he said softly. "Now you will know what it is to be truly bound." The air around her shifted, tore, and then she fell. A new world, a new fate. The impact was brutal, cold, unforgiving stone beneath her. A sky of orange and violet stretched above. A sun too harsh, a wind too sharp. The scent of damp soil and struggle thick in the air. Mora gasped, her entire body aching from the force of the landing. Pain, real, physical. No magic to dull it, no tricks to escape it. Around her she heard voices, rough, wary, but strong. A group of figures stood nearby, clad in armor worn and patched, their weapons not for conquest, but for defense. Their faces bore the lines of hardship, of resilience, of unity. They stared at her, not with fear nor reverence. A newcomer, like so many before, a burden until proven otherwise. Loki's voice echoed in her mind, a whisper of a god, far beyond her reach now. Survive, Mora, if you can. Earn your place if you dare, for you are nothing now. And so it begins. She is powerless. She is unknown. She is alone. And for the first time in her existence, Mora must fight, not to conquer, but to belong. Will she learn? Will she break? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain. Loki has already won, and Mora, she will never be the same again.